References in the Quran and Hadith. The Quran and Hadith do not explicitly mention autism or Asperger's syndrome, as these are modern diagnostic terms from the 20th century. However, Islamic scholars have retrospectively interpreted certain passages and narratives as reflecting themes of neurodiversity, disability, and divine equity. The Quran emphasizes compassion toward those with differences, stating in Surah Al-Baqarah 2:286, Allah does not burden a soul beyond that it can bear. This verse is often cited to affirm that individuals with cognitive or developmental challenges, including those we might now identify as autistic, are not held to the same religious obligations if they exceed their capacity. Similarly, Surah An-Nur 24:61 addresses exemptions for the blind, lame, or ill from certain duties, extending a principle of accommodation. In Hadith, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, modeled kindness toward those with differences. A notable example is the story of a companion who struggled with ritual purity due to a condition possibly akin to incontinence or a neurodevelopmental challenge, whom the Prophet instructed to perform ablution as best as possible without undue hardship. Some contemporary scholars speculate that the Prophet himself exhibited traits like intense focus or sensory sensitivities that align with neurodiversity, though this is interpretive and not a formal diagnosis. Narratives like that of Prophet Yahya, John the Baptist, described in the Quran, Surah Maryam 19:7-15, as having a speech impairment yet being granted wisdom, are seen as exemplars of valued neurodiverse individuals. Overall, these texts promote a holistic view. Neurodiversity is part of Allah's creation, deserving of mercy rather than stigma. Treatment and handling in the Umayyad Caliphate, 661–750 CE. Historical records from the Umayyad era yield little direct evidence on autism specifically, as the concept was unknown. However, the period's early Islamic governance built on Quranic principles of welfare, establishing rudimentary charitable systems, for example, zakat distribution, that supported vulnerable groups, including those with physical or mental impairments. Medical practices were influenced by pre-Islamic Arabian traditions and Greek translations, focusing on humoral balance for melancholy or madness, broad categories that might encompass autistic traits like social withdrawal or repetitive behaviors. Treatment likely involved family care or community support rather than institutionalization, with herbal remedies, for example, for calming agitation, prescribed by early physicians. Neurodiverse individuals were integrated where possible. For instance, court records show exemptions from military service for those deemed unfit due to cognitive differences. Stigma existed, tied to jinn possession beliefs, but Umayyad rulers like Caliph Umar II emphasized equity, funding aid for the afflicted. No evidence suggests persecution. Instead, survival depended on familial resources in this expansionist empire. Treatment and handling in the Abbasid Caliphate, 750–1258 CE. The Abbasid era, during the Islamic Golden Age, marked a pinnacle in medical advancements that indirectly addressed neurodiversity. Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated Greek texts, for example, Galen Hippocrates, fostering a psychosomatic approach to mental health. Physicians like Abu Zaid al-Balkhi, d. 934, pioneered holistic treatments in sustenance of the body and soul, categorizing neuroses, for example, obsessions, anxiety, akin to modern autism-related challenges, and recommending lifestyle interventions like diet, exercise, and environment to balance humors. Al-Razi, Razis, d. 925, described mania, epilepsy, and infantile stupor in Al-Hawi, advocating music therapy, baths, and moral support, early forms of sensory integration. By Maristans, hospitals in Baghdad and Damascus treated mental patients with dedicated wards, offering free care, including for cognitive disabilities. Patients received ethical treatment per Sharia, with exemptions from liability for physicians if procedures were standard. Neurodiverse individuals, often labeled under Junun, madness, were housed in these facilities or almshouses, with aftercare emphasized. High consanguinity rates increased congenital conditions, but Abbasid society valued intellectual contributions, e.g. savant-like scholars, fostering inclusion. Figures like Hunayn ibn Ishaq translated works on idiocy, viewing it as treatable imbalance rather than divine curse. Abbasid medical innovations for mental health humoral therapy, balancing black bile for melancholy via diet, herbs, addressed withdrawal or repetitive behaviors, music and occupational therapy, soothing agitation with sounds or activities, sensory regulation, similar to modern autism aids. Institutional care, Bimaristans, free holistic treatment with follow-up, supported integration, reduced isolation. Psychosomatic approach, linking mind-body for holistic healing, precursor to viewing autism as neurodevelopmental. Treatment and handling in the Ottoman Empire, 1299–1922 CE. In the Ottoman Empire, neurodiversity fell under broader disability frameworks, with treatment evolving from medieval Islamic traditions. Early Ottomans, 14th–16th centuries, relied on family and waqf endowments for care, viewing impairments through lenses of fate or jinn influence. By the 16th century, disability in the Ottoman Arab world documents court cases where deaf mutes used sign language in elite roles, for example palace servants, indicating accommodation for communication differences, potentially extending to autistic nonverbal traits. Mental health was addressed in Bimaristans like Edirnes, 1488, which segregated leprosy but integrated mental wards with humane methods, hydrotherapy, ethical restraints, and community reintegration. Ottoman fiqh, jurisprudence, exempted the majnun, insane, from religious duties, protecting property rights via guardians. High-functioning neurodiverse individuals contributed as artisans or scholars. Consanguinity led to higher disability rates, but taimar, land grants, sometimes supported afflicted families. Late Ottoman reforms, Tanzimat, 19th century, introduced Western-influenced asylums, but stigma persisted, with some attributing behaviors to sorcery. Overall, treatment balanced compassion with practical support, though rural areas lagged. Medieval Islamic culture's approach to autistic individuals and neurodiversity. Medieval Islamic culture, roughly 8th–15th centuries, approached neurodiversity through a blend of religious compassion, medical science, and social welfare, contrasting Europe's often punitive views, for example, demonic possession. Autism-like traits were subsumed under mental disorders like Hasad, obsession, or Cain, fear, treated holistically. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, d. 1037, in Canon of Medicine, linked mental states to physiology, prescribing regimens for infantile autism-like stupor via environment and ethics. Society emphasized inclusion. The Prophet's hadith urged mercy. Allah is merciful to those who are merciful, leading to zakat-funded aid. Neurodiverse people were exempt from Hajj or fasting if burdensome, and savant abilities, for example, memory and scholars, were celebrated. However, urban-rural divides meant elite access to Bimaristans, while rural folk relied on folk healers. Stigma from jinn beliefs could isolate, but Sharia protections, for example, no forced marriage for the impaired, promoted dignity. Autistic individuals on the Silk Road. Direct historical accounts of autistic individuals on the Silk Road, 2nd century BCE, 14th century CE, are absent, as the network was a trade conduit, not a disability chronicle. Travelers faced harsh conditions, banditry, nomad raids, isolation, that would challenge sensory sensitivities or social navigation common in autism. However, the route's diversity, spanning Abbasid, Mongol and Tang empires, likely exposed neurodiverse merchants or monks to varied tolerances. In Islamic-controlled segments, for example Baghdad to Samarkand, protections mirrored Abbasid practices. Caravanserais offered rest, and humoral medicine addressed travel melancholy. Buddhist sites like Dunhuang Caves depict eccentric ascetics, possibly neurodiverse, valued for insight. Survival hinged on family caravan support. High-mortality journeys might exclude vulnerable individuals, but integrated ones, for example as scribes, thrived via routine. No evidence of targeted mistreatment. Instead, the road's cultural exchange could foster acceptance, as seen in tolerant Sogdian communities. Modern analogies suggest neurodiverse strengths, for example pattern recognition, aided navigation or trade.